In August 1987, at age 75, my grandfather, Emil Offenbacher, wrote a short memoir about the first 35 years of his life. He wrote it in Jamaica, Vermont, where he and my grandmother Anne spent their summers. My father, Claude, and my Aunt Florence often visited them there, as did I and their other grandchildren, to whom Grandpa Emil dedicated his memoir. This is how he began. For Toby, Anthony, Andy, and Matthew. That's me. I look up at the window to the dark trees at the end of our meadow and the green mountains behind them and think to myself, this is the end of a long line. How much do my grandchildren know about the beginnings of this line and its progress up to this point? How much do they care to know? I believe that sooner or later they will want to know. Tonight I will try to give them some of the essentials.
I hesitated for a long time to share my life story. Anne and I have almost made it a religion to avoid anything which would emphasize our personal importance. Can anybody who considers his life unimportant speak about it? True, there were extraordinary events in my lifetime which have changed its course to a considerable extent, but these were world events about which all has already been written, and mostly with much more talent than is given to me. And I wonder, would there have been anything at all to relate if I had been allowed to continue my life the way it was during its first 20 years? I will begin with the crucial point of my story. I was born a German and a Jew. I grew up as a fervent German and a fervent Jew. I believe this will sound more or less unintelligible to future generations, since it has become already a purely historical fact in my own lifetime. But during a comparatively short time in history, just about 100 years, it seemed an immovable way of life to a whole group of people from whom I descended. The families into which I was born had lived in Germany for many centuries. Up to the beginning of the 19th century, their lives were homogeneous. They were first and foremost Jews who had adjusted to living in Germany as a separate minority. The emancipation of the Jews at the beginning of the 19th century led the German Jews in two different directions: complete assimilation or a synthesis of Judaism and Germanism. I am a product of the latter. The school I went to, the elementary and junior high school of the rather unique Orthodox Jewish congregations at Frankfurt, was itself a unique institution. It served 3 generations, of which I belonged to the last. Its aims were to imbue its students simultaneously with German and Jewish culture. It seemed at the time that it reached these aims. In retrospect, however, I believe it must be considered a failure. Its students were unprepared for the revolutionary developments within their ethnic and religious body, of which the forebodings were already well visible in the time of my youth. That questions of ethnicity and nationality should play such a crucial part in my life is, in a way, ironical. I was 9 years old when World War I ended and Germany turned from an empire into a republic. While the years of my childhood were lived against a highly patriotic background, my formative years stood under the sign of the revolution, foremost the Russian Revolution, which seemed to announce an era of liberalism. Like many of my contemporaries, I adopted the idea of liberalism, which became our guiding light from which we were unable to free ourselves, even when we became aware of its shortcomings. We stubbornly clung to it, while the world went into the other direction. But for a short while we were sustained in our beliefs. I remember the enthusiasm with which I attended one of the earliest performances of Brecht's Threepenny Opera when I lived in Berlin in 1928. I was 19 years old at the time, and I said to myself, this is an announcement of things to come, like Beaumarchais' Figaro, which announced the French Revolution. Alas, the things to come were quite different. I believe that everybody who gives some thought to the formation of his character looks back to one person in his early life, mostly a parent or a teacher. In my case, this role was taken up by my mother's only brother. His name was Siegfried Schwarzschild, and we called him Uncle Fritz. Although on the outside his way of life was indistinguishable from that of my parents, no greater contrast in their personalities could be imagined. My parents were both extroverts. My father, intelligent, even brilliant, and rather vain, had a great curiosity for everything around him. My mother's outstanding feature was her resoluteness, accepting life as it came. She was a tower of strength to her husband and children, and in strict contrast to this, Uncle Fritz was the retiring and studious type, and at the same time his personal relationships were more genuine than my father's. There were only two accepted careers for the class to which he belonged: business and the professions, the one offering profit, the other one status. Uncle Fritz chose to study law and obtained his doctorate, which was the sign of nobility among the German Jewish bourgeoisie. His career was interrupted by World War I. His war years, of which he often spoke to us as children, were one of the two momentous events in his life. The other one was the Zionist movement, to whose earliest adherents in Germany he belonged since his student days. How daring this attitude was is difficult to understand for anyone born after the foundation of the State of Israel. Zionism in those days, and until the advent of Hitler, was an absolute taboo among the Orthodox German Jews to whom my family belonged. To be, like Uncle Fritz, a Zionist, and at the same time an Orthodox Jew, was something almost unheard of. Uncle Fritz took as his motto a variation of the Roman author, "I am a Jew, nothing which is Jewish is alien to me." However, he never tried to convert me to Zionism. Instead, he introduced me to music. He was an accomplished pianist, and to great literature. He liked to read to us from the works of the great German poets, of which Heine was his favorite, but also from the lesser-known classics which we never heard of in school. Reading, already at that early stage in my life, was my greatest enjoyment, and this brought me closest to my uncle. When after the war Uncle Fritz changed his profession to that of antiquarian bookseller, it determined my future. I was only 12 years old when I wrote a short school essay in which I declared that I wanted to become an antiquarian bookseller. With the exception of 2 short stages of my career, I have done nothing else. I never went to high school. At the age of 16, my father placed me in a small banking firm in Frankfurt. His opinion was that training as a banker was the best basis for any non-academic career. I worked in the bank for 3 years. Looking back at that time, I'm surprised at the enthusiasm I brought to my work, which during its later part included some lively participation in the stock market. I'm sorry to say, though, that I did not derive any profit from that training. My interest in banking and the stock market did not last, and today I am more removed from it than ever. That this should be so must have to do with my attitude toward money. Earning much money needs a strong drive and the courage to take risks. I completely lack that drive and that courage. Money was foremost in my mind as long as I did not have any. As soon as I had enough to live on, it lost its interest for me. During my years in the bank, I never forgot my early aim, the antiquarian book business. In those days, the antiquarian book dealer often was also an art dealer, particularly in the field of drawings and the graphic arts. In 1928, it was decided that I should leave my parents' house. My father found for me, through one of our relatives, an unpaid position in one of the prominent Berlin art galleries and auction houses. In hindsight, the signals of the approaching catastrophe were only too visible, but at the time they moved in the background against the splendor of the cultural highlights of the Weimar Republic, which concentrated in its capital city as never before or afterwards. The Berlin theater of the 1920s has now become legendary. On the surface, Berlin was a glamorous city. The glamour was much in evidence at the place where I worked. I began to learn the trade by preparing the catalog of a splendid collection of books formed by Napoleon's stepson and preserved until then in his wife's German family. The auctions themselves were society events where I got acquainted with the Berlin elite. I remember only a few of these people, one of whom was Dr. Richard Strauss, the composer, who collected English color prints of the 18th century. After a year and a half in Berlin, I was curious to see some parts of Europe. It was decided that I should spend half a year in Paris and the other half in London to perfect my foreign languages. For a foreigner, it was impossible to obtain permission for employment in these countries. After searching for a while for a bookshop who would take me on without payment, I was referred to Monsieur Frédéric Monnier, who operated a small shop in the Rue de Clichy. Monsieur Monnier took me on immediately, without having the slightest use for my services. He dealt mostly in modern first editions and illustrated books, with erotica as a specialty. Monsieur Monnier was a rich man, which did not show in his very modest shop. It had neither a telephone nor a typewriter. There was even no watch on the premises, so Monsieur Monnier went outside his shop from time to time to consult the clock in front of a neighboring clockmaker's shop, often exclaiming, "Ah, ce n'est pas encore midi! Darn, it isn't noon yet." What a contrast to my previous employers for whom the workday was always too short. The second part of this year, 1930, I spent in London to perfect myself in the language and to get an overview of the British rare book market. I lived in a boarding house on Gloucester Terrace, where I shared a huge room with a fireplace with my friend Bernard Benjamin, with whom I had gone to school. In London, I got acquainted with some of the giants of my profession. Since I had left school, I had lived largely at my parents' expense. It was now time for me to become independent. Early in 1931, I got a job with the antiquarian bookseller firm J. Hall in Munich, where I stayed for the next 2 years. I loved Munich. It's a beautiful town, and it was at that time the capital of the antiquarian book trade in Germany. There were about half a dozen booksellers of world renown, each with a large stock of valuable books. By the time I entered the firm of Hall, its founder had died, and the business was conducted by his widow, assisted by one of the most renowned German bibliographers, Ernst Schult Strathaus. He was a strict taskmaster, but an excellent teacher. Unfortunately, he was also an early adherent of Adolf Hitler, and he later became a prominent party official. It did not seem to bother him at the time that he owed his very good living to a Jewish firm. I was happy in Munich, and even more so after I was joined by Anne. She continued her law studies at the university after having attended the University of Heidelberg. Although we both grew up in Frankfurt, I had known Anne only since I came back from Berlin at the beginning of 1930. I was introduced to her by my brother Eric, who had known her for some time and whose stories about her made me curious to meet her. I fell in love with Anne right away. Her motto was, "Wer glücklich ist, verdient zu sein." The one who is happy deserves it. She was, and is, the most cheerful person I ever met, and her cheerful outlook on life has sustained me now for more than 50, not always easy, years. I stayed altogether 2 years in Munich. During that time, the international depression had made deep dents into the financial situation of the European middle class. The important metal firm for whom my father worked was beginning to liquidate. The business of Anne's father came to an end, and he and his wife made a living by managing a cigar store. The depression made itself also felt in Mrs. Hall's business, where my position was reduced to a part-time job. On January 31st, 1933, I passed by a news poster on the Ludwigstrasse in Munich. The wording was short, but probably the most portentous of the century. It said that the president of the German Reich had appointed Adolf Hitler, the leader of the strongest party in the German parliament, as chancellor. The triumph of evil, long dreaded but never really believed, had arrived. I decided to go home to Frankfurt and await further developments. I spent the rest of the year at my parents' house doing some business on my own, but much of this time was spent by making plans for the future. The measures the Nazis took against the Jews were applied progressively. This led many Jews to delude themselves by wishfully thinking that they could accommodate themselves to the changed conditions. Since the alternative was leaving their homeland to start a new life in a foreign country, a difficult decision to make, their hesitation was understandable. Nobody was able to foresee the horrible ending of the story, which had just begun. It was the decision of my mother that the time had come for us to leave the country which saved us. Her reasoning was that while there might still be time to leave later, the time to be admitted by other countries would be limited. This was a prophetic view. By the end of 1933, the dispersion of our family began. 1 year later, my parents had found a new home in Amsterdam, and with them my youngest brother and my only sister, who both later settled in Palestine. My brother Eric had left for America, and I started to build myself a new existence in Paris. With money provided by my father, I was able to buy a section of Mrs. Hall's stock. These were all books in the exact and occult sciences and some medicine, which determined the direction of my business up to this day. My office was a hole in the wall on the ground floor of an apartment building near the Madeleine Church. It consisted of 2 bookshelves with a small desk in between and very little space to move around. Anne had already moved to France several months earlier. She had found a job in an orphan asylum near Paris. By the time I arrived, she lived with a French family where she took care of the 2 children. In August 1934, we were married by the mayor of the 8th arrondissement in Paris, followed by a religious ceremony at my parents' house in Amsterdam a few days later. We rented a modest apartment in a modern building in Vincennes, a suburb of Paris whose population mostly consisted of people with small incomes. Its greatest attraction was its situation near the famous woods, the Bois de Vincennes, and its proximity to the center of Paris, which could be reached in a 20-minute subway ride. We were very poor in the first years of our marriage, but we were happy. I've always been grateful for the fact that I was poor when I was young instead of being poor in old age, after having witnessed the contrary in the generation which preceded us. It also helped that all our friends were in the same situation at that time. One day, an Englishman of about my age appeared at my office and asked if I had any early books on alchemy. This was one of my specialties at that time. I eagerly took one book after another from my shelves. The customer looked at them shortly and piled them up on my desk. And when I had shown him everything I had, he asked, "Any more?" and then said, "Please send them to me." He gave me his card, which showed that his name was Dennis Tuvine and that he lived in one of the elegant new apartment houses near the Invalides. It turned out that he was a chemist from a rich English family who was doing some work at the Sorbonne at the time. During a sickness, somebody had given him John Reed's book Prelude to Chemistry to read, which contains many attractive illustrations from early books on alchemy. These pictures had appealed to him, and he asked Maurice Ettinghausen, the only English bookseller in Paris he knew, whether these books were still available for purchase. Ettinghausen sent him to me, and he became my first substantial customer. It was also the first time that I had the opportunity to build up an important collection from its beginnings. Dennis was extremely generous to me. He never bargained, and also let me work on the catalog of his collection. This meant, of course, an enormous change in our financial situation, as it relieved us from our constant worrying about money. Claude was born in 1936, and the next years would have been entirely happy for us if the events in Germany would not have become more and more threatening. Anne's parents had lived in Germany during those years. Her father had spent some time in a concentration camp. They finally managed to emigrate to America, but they were both sick, and they died before we came to that country. In the early fall of 1938, it looked as if the war with Germany was imminent. Then came Munich and Chamberlain's prophecy of peace in our time. Although we should have known better, we felt relieved and decided to have a second child. In preparation, we moved to a larger apartment in a nice neighborhood in Saint-Mandé with a view of the zoo. The few months before the summer of 1939 were the high point of our life in France. It ended in an extended vacation during the month of August, which we spent on the seaside at the tiny village of Jars-sur-Mer in the Vendée. The house we lived in belonged to an old woman who lived from catching fish in the sea and selling them, and who during the summer rented her house while she lived in her barn. It was a beautiful summer, but there was a general feeling that the good times could not last. The thunderbolt came on August 23rd, when it became known that the Germans had just concluded a treaty with the Russians after having delayed a treaty with the Allies for several weeks. From that moment on, the war with Germany was a certainty, and it took only a week for it to start. By this time, most people were convinced of its inevitability, and the general sentiment was, let's get it over with.
But of course, the war was to last another 6 years. My grandparents, Anne and Emil, soon found themselves fleeing for their lives with 2 small children, my father Claude and my Aunt Florence, aged 4 and 1.
Since Paris was expected to be the first target of the enemy, we decided to stay at the seaside for the time being. I immediately decided to volunteer for the French army. My reasoning was that if ever a war was fought in which I had a personal stake, it was this one. Consequently, on the first Sunday in September, the day the war was officially declared, I took the train to the nearest city, La Roche-sur-Yon, where the recruiting office was situated. When I arrived at the recruiting office, however, there was a sign saying that the office was closed on Sunday. In retrospect, this was symptomatic for the way the French conducted the war. I had planned to return to Jars on the same evening, but since I had now to present myself again the next morning, I stayed overnight at a local hotel. At the recruiting office the next day, my services were declined. We have not yet decided what to do with people born in Germany. You will be notified. It turned out that my sojourn at the hotel in La Roche-sur-Yon was my undoing. In filling in the guest card, I faithfully had given Germany as my native country. A few days after my return to Jars, the gendarme came to our house and took me away to a camp for enemy aliens in nearby Sable d'Olonne. The camp was an improvised facility located in a sardine factory of the firm Amieux, whose motto, toujours à mieux, always to the better, was widely advertised on the premises. During the day, we were occupied by doing work in the fields, mostly arranging large blocks of timber. I remember that at one point I was carrying on my shoulder a large tree trunk whose other end rested on the shoulders of a German aristocrat. It so happened that a week after I entered the camp was Yom Kippur. I was one of about a half a dozen inmates who had asked to be dispensed from work on that day, for which we obtained permission. On that same day, a commission visited the camp who was to sort out Czechoslovakian citizens who wished to be released for joining the army. When this became known to our little group of celebrants of Yom Kippur, one of us had the bright idea. Why don't we ask the commission if aliens with French wives or children could not also be released from the camp? We presented ourselves before the commission immediately. The captain asked for proof of relationship. I showed him my identity card, in which the French citizenship of my son was noted. He declared that I was free to leave the next morning. This happened in the late afternoon, around the time our co-internees returned from work. We ran out to meet them and gave them the good news. The ones to whom the decision applied rushed to the office, where they were told it was now 6 o'clock, the commission had finished its work for the day, and that they should come back the next day. Alas, the commission never came back, and our co-sufferers were to spend the months until the armistice in the camp. What I like to call the miracle of Yom Kippur apparently only profited those who respected the Day of Atonement. Shortly after I was reunited with my family, we were informed that we could no longer stay at the seaside. It had been reported that I was standing on the waterfront every night with my flashlight, giving signals to German boats. So we were to proceed to the nearest larger town, which happened to be Niort. Here we found rooms just outside the city in the house of a French family, the Porcherons, which consisted of father, mother, son, daughter, and grandmother. We had the use of their garden and were quite happy there, except for the uncertainty of the future. I even used my involuntary freedom to make regular visits to the New York Public Library. I also continued my business in a very limited way. It was here in New York that Florence was born in February 1940. The doctor who delivered her was dressed in the uniform of the French army. During all that time, neither one of the belligerent armies had made any decisive move. It was the period which the French called drôle de guerre, or the Strange War. This period suddenly ended in May 1940, when the Germans invaded Holland and Belgium. Totally unprepared, the French became panicky. All enemy aliens, this time without exception, were ordered to present themselves at the nearest camp, hastily installed for that purpose. So, once again, I was separated from Anne and the children, and found myself traveling north to the camp I was assigned to, Camp Ruchard on the Loire River. During the approximately 4 weeks I spent at Ruchard, I met some old friends and made the acquaintance of some interesting people. Among the inmates were some members of the intellectual elite of German refugees who hitherto had escaped internment. Now, however, they were indiscriminately taken in, notwithstanding the fact that they were Hitler's staunchest adversaries. That the French were completely unaware of this was demonstrated at the time of the abrupt termination of our sojourn from the camp. In June, after the Germans had invaded France and a truce had been concluded, the commander of the camp assembled us in the courtyard and made a little speech, telling us that in view of the circumstances he had to let us go and that he had only one request, namely, that as an old army officer who had served this country for many years, he wished we would show our respect for him by not giving our joy too open expression. To this, the audience replied by unanimously shouting, "Vive la France!" which left the poor man in utter confusion. At no point had he realized that his prisoners were in much greater danger of being captured by the Germans than were he or his colleagues. We were free now, that is, free to run as fast as we could without a given destination. Our only direction was to the south, since the Germans were advancing from the north. For the next 2 weeks, I walked through a sizable part of France, sleeping in the fields or in barns, always in the company of my comrades from the camp and crowds of a fleeing population and deserting soldiers. I saw many of the older people falling exhausted by the wayside, and occasionally we were bombed by Italian airplanes. The Italians had entered the war only in the last minute and concluded the truce with France only several days after the Germans. When I reached Limoges, my feet were bleeding. There I learned that according to the conditions of the ceasefire, France had been divided into an occupied zone in the north and an unoccupied zone in the south, with Vichy as its capital. Limoges was the first city we came to which was included in the unoccupied zone. What a relief! We did not have to run any longer. We stayed only a short time in Limoges, during which we were assigned to the municipal stadium, where we slept on straw in a big hall. A few days later, our group of refugees was ordered to move to the nearby town of Bellac, where we were put in French army uniforms and assigned to a work camp as prestataires, a hitherto rarely used designation which meant providers of certain services. Our work consisted in arranging vehicles in a car park so that they could be taken over by the Germans in good order. This was hardly any work at all, and only a poor excuse to keep us busy while the Vichy government decided what to do with us. Given the circumstances, this was as desirable a situation as we could wish for, except for those who, like myself, lived in uncertainty about the fate of their families. I had left Anne and our 2 children in Niort, now situated in the occupied zone. While I was in Limoges, I was able to send them the kind of postcards which the Germans allowed to be sent from the non-occupied to the occupied zone, the text of which was pre-printed and left room for only very short personal data. All Anne therefore knew of me was that I had escaped to the non-occupied zone and that I had reached Limoges, while I had no news from her whatsoever. I was worried, as she had only little money left, and I knew about the difficulties to pass from the occupied to the non-occupied zone. In fact, Anne, who had gone through some painful experiences in Niort, including her having to leave her dwelling place because the Porcheron family was afraid to have her with them any longer, had decided to join a family here at Limoges. She actually succeeded in passing the demarcation line with her 2 small children under rather dramatic circumstances, and was assisted by one of her traveling companions, a friendly Frenchman, who turned out to be the mayor of Bellac, Maître des Bordes. When he learned that Anne's destination was Limoges, he persuaded her to come with him to Bellac, from where Limoges was easy to reach. Bellac at that time was the place to which the American Red Cross had relocated, and Anne decided to go there to find out about the possibility of sending Claude to America, where my parents had moved to from Holland. It so happened that I had gone to the Red Cross a few days earlier for the same reason, and that the worker remembered my visit. While she could not be of any help to Anne as far as Claude was concerned, she was able to tell her that I came to her in a French army uniform, and that a group of foreign workers were stationed in a French army camp just outside of Bellac, where she would have a chance of finding me. Anne has often told the story of how she came to the camp with Claude at her hand when I was away at work, and where a colleague, with whom she inquired for me and who remembered only my last name, assured her immediately of my presence when she showed him Claude and asked him if the Offenbacher he knew could be the father of this boy. Claude, as a child, resembled me strikingly. Our family now being reunited again, we had to find a place to live. Not an easy undertaking at this particular moment. With the help of Maître des Bordes, we found a house in Bellac, where we were to spend the next 7 months. Under any other circumstances, this house would have been far from ideal. There were rats in the upper room where the children slept, and in winter this room was so bitterly cold that we found one morning a ring of ice around Florence's little thumb, which she had sucked during the night. In spite of this, we were generally envied for having found this house. During the winter of 1940-41, it became the meeting place for our friends, who gathered every evening around the small stove on our ground floor. Among them were several very bright young men with an excellent sense of humor who contributed in a brilliant way to our conversation. They all perished later when the Germans occupied the whole of France. Although I remember having worn the French uniform until the time I left France, my services as a prestataire must have ended earlier, as I was able to use my days for walking the countryside in the search of food. I became quite an expert in buying eggs from farmers. I had learned by experience never to ask for more than 1 egg from each farmer for my hungry children. It was a request which was usually granted, although very reluctantly and at an outrageous price. My parents, who lived now in America, had arranged for us to receive some money through a business associate of my father's in Switzerland. At the same time, they made enormous efforts to get us out of France and to the United States, a problem which presented immense difficulties. The quota for people born in Germany who wished to immigrate to the U.S. was, for obvious reasons, filled for years. The reason that my parents had no difficulties in this respect was that my father's birthplace was Paris. After an exchange of numerous letters and telegrams, we finally learned that a certificate of immigration to Cuba was procured by my parents, from where immigration to the U.S. would be only a formality, due to the fact that only relatively few people could escape from Europe at that time. What now began was the chase for traveling papers, a passport, the French exit visa, and the visa for Spain, from where the boat for Cuba would leave. I had lost my German citizenship and consequently my German passport. Since I was not a French citizen, I did not have a French passport either. However, to obtain a visa, a passport, or at least a traveling paper, it had to be obtained from the country of which I had last been a citizen. Germany did not have an ambassador in the non-occupied zone, where it was represented by the Swedish consul. I consequently traveled to Vichy to obtain a German passport. The representatives of all the foreign countries in the non-occupied zone at that time were lodged at the Hôtel des Ambassadeurs in Vichy, one of the big hotels of that famous spa. I still remember entering the room in the hotel which served the Swedish consul as living room, office, and bedroom. Some diapers were prominently displayed on a string over the sink. I asked the consul for a German passport. I was dressed in a French army uniform, which caused the consul to ask how I could expect to obtain a German passport being a member of the French army. An explanation was given, and the consul agreed to submit my request to the Armistice Commission in Wiesbaden. I had to stay in Vichy a few days to expect the answer. When I returned to the consul, he had received the authorization from Wiesbaden to provide me with a traveling paper. He refused, however, to put my children's names on it, as they were French citizens. They traveled on Anne's German passport, which had not yet expired. For the Cuban visa, Anne and I had to travel to Marseille, where we were almost caught in a police action caused by the arrival of Maréchal Pétain. Meanwhile, the date on which the boat left, for which my father had booked tickets for us, came nearer, and the visa for our passage through Spain had not arrived. This time I had to go to Lyon, where the visa was delivered to me in the very last minute. 2 days later, we were on our way to Spain. Since our boat was leaving from Bilbao, the logical way for us to enter Spain would have been to cross the border at the southwestern coast of France, from where the distance to Bilbao is very short. This part of France, however, belonged to the occupied zone, so we had to make the enormous detour to the eastern coast of France, down to Barcelona, and across all of Spain to Bilbao. We spent the first night of our trip at Barcelona. This was shortly after the Spanish Civil War had ended, and there was hardly anything left to eat. When I went to the railroad station to buy our tickets for the trip to Bilbao, I was told the trains were only running 3 times a week and that they were sold out for months. Our boat was to leave 2 days later. Under these circumstances, we packed our belongings and went to the station at the time when the next train to Bilbao was due, gave our luggage to a porter together with a big tip, and asked him to carry it into the train. When the train arrived, it was full to the brim. The porter succeeded in procuring 1 seat for Anne and the children, while I was standing up through the whole night. In the early morning hours, we came to Le Gragnon, where we had to leave the train because the rails were flooded. A taxi was found which agreed to take us, but not our luggage, to the nearest railroad station where we would continue our trip. We left our luggage with a porter at Le Gragnon, who promised to expedite it immediately to Bilbao. We made the rest of the trip in a local train where we were comfortably seated, and where we got into a conversation with a nice elderly lady who asked us where we planned to stay in Bilbao. We told her that we had liked the hotel in Barcelona and planned to stay at one which belonged to the same chain. The lady thereupon advised us not to go to this hotel, which was extremely expensive, and recommended an excellent and much cheaper hotel called Hotel d'Inglaterra, which had the added advantage of being situated right next to the railroad station where we arrived. We thanked her profusely. When we arrived in Bilbao, we went immediately to the Hotel d'Inglaterra. I left Anne and the children on a couch in the hall of the hotel and went to the reception desk for the formalities of checking in. When this was done, I went back to my family and found Anne ashen and visibly alarmed, pointing at a large photo on the other side of the hall, a life-size picture of Adolf Hitler. Here we were running away from this man and ending up right in his arms. The truth in this case was, however, less horrible than it appeared. Mr. Leffler, the owner of the hotel, was a German who was married to an English woman, hence the name of the hotel. As a German subject, he was obliged to show his adherence to the Nazi regime. In fact, his conversing with us in German was very helpful in view of our ignorance of the Spanish language. The first instance of the help we received from Mr. Leffler was when we arrived at the office of the shipping company to have our cabins assigned for the tickets my parents had bought for us. We were told that no more room was available on the boat. Only after we insisted, assisted by Mr. Leffler, who acted as interpreter, were our tickets honored. We succeeded to obtain accommodations which were far below the ones my parents had paid for. As a matter of fact, cabins on the few available boats were oversold many times, and we were lucky to be accommodated at all. Our next problem was that the little money we had left was in foreign currency, which it was impossible to exchange against Spanish money at that particular time. I happened to recall the name of a business friend of my father at Bilbao. We went to his house, where we presented him with our difficulties. The man spoke only Spanish, but his sister, who lived with him, was able to translate our story from the French. He graciously gave us some money, but refused to take our foreign currency. When my father, a short while later, sent him the amount we had borrowed from him, it was returned to him with a note saying that he did not recall the matter. But our troubles were not yet over. Our luggage, which we had left at Logronio, had not arrived on the eve of the departure of our boat. I decided to travel back to Logronio with a note from Mr. Leffler explaining the situation. I still remember vividly my arrival at midnight in that romantic old Spanish town in full moonlight, where the only person to be found at the station at the time was a policeman to whom I handed my note. He asked me a question, which I understood to mean that he wanted me to describe the porter with whom we had left our luggage. I answered his question as well as I could, and he took me for a walk through the medieval moonlit streets until we came to an old house with a balcony, where my guide shouted a name which after a while caused the appearance of a yawning man in a nightshirt on the balcony, who indeed turned out to be our porter. He assured me that our luggage had in the meantime safely arrived in Bilbao and went to bed again. I took the next train back to Bilbao, where I arrived in the morning of the day of our departure, which was scheduled for the afternoon. After a long search, it turned out that our luggage had been at the pier since the day before, but in a place where it had not been previously located. Since these were all our earthly belongings, we were much relieved. In fact, it was a sorry assembly of heteroclite objects, which embarrassed my father greatly when we appeared with it at his elegant apartment house on the Upper East Side of New York, under the disdainful look of the doorman. But that was still 1 month ahead. In the meantime, we spent 18 days on board the good ship Magallanes under circumstances which at other times would have appeared to us rather unpleasant, but which in our state of euphoria of having escaped all danger, we accepted without complaints. When we arrived in Cuba, we were met by my parents. They had come from New York in an excursion boat in which we returned with them after a week spent in Havana. The first few days in Havana, we were retained in a refugee camp, which we considered a marvelous place compared to our previous living conditions. We then received our papers and spent the remaining days with our parents in the most beautiful section of Havana. We arrived in New York at the end of March 1941. I was 31 years old. Thanks to my parents, we had escaped from an unprecedented catastrophe. Only 1 year later, news reached us of the terrible fate of some of our close relatives and friends which we had left behind, among them 2 of my aunts and my cousin, Emil Offenbacher, the constant companion of my youth. We were both named after the same grandfather, and his young wife. They were all taken by the Nazis in Holland, deported, and put to death. It is still difficult for us to grasp the completely irrational horror of these years. But for us, life continued, and I had to think of the future in the new country for me and my family. The small stock of books I owned I had left in Paris, and I never recovered it. I had set my hope on the arrival in America of Dr. Erwin Rosenthal, who, when I met him in Paris, spoke of his plans to continue his business in the United States, where I could possibly work for him. His firm, founded by his father, Jacques Rosenthal, was one of the most renowned rare book establishments in Germany, before Hitler. We spent the summer in Brighton Beach, the only place on the seaside which could be reached from New York by a 5-cent subway fare, where we rented a bungalow and where Claude acquired his knowledge of English by playing with the other children. When, after 2 months, Dr. Rosenthal arrived, he rented an office on Madison Avenue, where a firm bearing my name was established. I worked there for the next 2 years, the latter part of which at a different address, 555 Fifth Avenue. Dr. Rosenthal paid me a very generous salary of $50, later $60 a week. Many of my fellow refugees worked for $12 a week at that time. The antiquarian book business was still suffering from the recession of the 1930s and was far from brilliant. I remember that early one morning when I was alone in the office, Dr. Streeter from the Yale Medical Library came in and bought a book. About an hour later, Erwin Rosenthal arrived, together with his brother-in-law, Professor Leonardo Olszki, and I greeted them, beaming all over with the words, "I just sold a book." Leonardo Olszki looked puzzled. "Young man," he asked, "isn't that the usual thing?" Alas, it was not. Another day, when I was again in the office all by myself, a tall, distinguished-looking gentleman came in who wished to see some of our incunabula. At that time, I was still very eager to show my knowledge, and when I put before him a 15th century piece of printing by the printer Jensen, I commented, "You know, this is the type which inspired Bruce Rogers, the renowned type designer, when he designed his famous Bible." My customer looked down at me from his height and said quietly, "I am Bruce Rogers." This taught me a lesson. Sometime after the United States had entered the war, it became evident that I had to make a decision, either to enlist into the army or change to essential war work. In spite of my absolute incompetence in anything mechanical, I decided for the latter, since I had now the responsibility for a family, including 2 small children. I therefore attended a trade school where I learned how to operate a lathe. A distant relative who worked for the duration in a small machine shop in Manhattan got me a job at his working place. Here I spent the next 2 years, the most unhappy ones in my whole life. Not so much because of the environment. My colleagues actually were a rather nice bunch of people, but because of my constant feeling of inadequacy. On the day the armistice was signed, my services were not needed any longer, and I lost my job. At that time, my self-esteem was at such a low point that I had almost lost the courage to continue my original profession, which I had now to do on my own account. However, having no other choice, I began to conduct my business from home on a small scale. It took several months until I found my confidence again, and the exact point when that happened is the subject of a story which I have often told. One day, I received the catalog of a rather indifferent book sale at the Swan Auction Galleries in New York. Included in this catalog was the description of a small incunable of a religious text, which caught my eye. As every antiquarian bookseller knows, religious texts, even in 15th century editions, are rarely of great commercial value. However, The rather short description of the book mentioned a woodcut on the title page representing a woman and a dog. This caught my attention. A secular representation in a religious book? The books were exhibited a few days before the sale, and I went to the exhibition to look at the little volume. The moment I saw the title page, I realized that the woman was not a woman, and the dog was not a dog. Much more appropriate to the text, it represented Saint Jerome and the lion. However, the cataloger who described it as a woman and a dog could be excused. The style of the woodcut was far removed from the stiff representations usually found in 15th century books, and the flowing gown of Saint Jerome could be taken for the one of a woman, just as the nervous movement of the lion for the movement of a leaping dog. It was obvious that the illustration was the work not of the usual artisan woodcutter, but of a real artist. Who was he? I took a look at the imprint at the end of the text, which said Basel, Bergman von Olpe, 1492. This was the printer and the period of a famous illustrated book, The Ship of Fools by Sebastian Brandt, the illustrations of which have been attributed to Albrecht Dürer. It needed only a little research to ascertain that the woodcut in the little book at the Swan Galleries was a work of Dürer, who at that time was traveling through Basel, where he worked for the printer Bergman von Olpe. I bought the book at a low price and sold it shortly afterwards for what appeared at the time a very nice profit. However, it was not this profit which gave me so much pleasure as the fact that it gave me back the confidence in the work I was doing and have continued to do until this day. Here I am ending my story. The 40 years that followed were not eventful enough to be told. On the whole, they were happy years, and happy people have no history. My hope is that this happiness will last until the end of my days.
That was my dad, Claude Offenbacher, aged 84, reading his father, my grandfather, Emil's memoir. My grandfather died in August of 1990 at age 81, 6 years after he wrote his memoir. I was 19 at the time. His work as an antiquarian book dealer continues to be held in great esteem. His annual catalogs, annotated with his characteristic erudition and great wit, are themselves now treasured by libraries and bibliophiles. My grandmother, Anne, lived an additional 14 years until 2004, many of them spent in a sunny spot in the Bay Area near my Aunt Florence. In the melancholy Vermont dusk, Grandpa mused that this is the end of a long line. And indeed, the unimaginable upheavals that touched his and my grandmother, my dad, and my aunt's lives are set firmly in the past. The line, however, continues its circuitous path. Persecuted minorities, almost insurmountable borders, fragile democracies, and imminent catastrophes are our present. Grandpa was right. This is a story that I want to know and to revisit often as inspiration for work yet to be done.